So here we go with part two of week 2, the colonial transformation of Southeast Asia. In this part of the lecture, we'll look at how colonial penetration in Southeast Asia was accelerated when the Industrial Revolution occurred in the West. In sum, the Industrial Revolution made more urgent and important the application of power and the capture of resources that would enhance national power, and therefore the capture of large amounts of territory instead of simply maintaining trading entrepôts to bring back spices and other knickknacks for use in the households of Europe. Now we're talking about navies that can be fast enough to beat the other guy's navy, armies that have weapons that were produced in sufficient quantities to defeat the other guy's army. Now we're talking national survival, and while I'm not making any apologies for colonialism, I'm simply noting what was. It were what it were, it is what it is, it was what it was. Let's go to slide 15 in the PowerPoint. Now this is only one country's imperial expansion. It's the British. The British, having lost its North American colonies, faced a couple of problems. One of them was that it needed to do something with its lawbreakers that it previously had been sending to America. Australians like to say, and since I have an Australian passport, I'm going to use my cartoony Australian accent to make this point. They'll say, mate, your country was founded by pilgrims, our country was founded by convicts. That's convicts. And there's certainly some truth to that, although it's not really very representative of the actual truth. Only a small number of people who ended up in Australia, even in the late 19th century, were descendants of convicts. Most were descendants of ordinary people who went to Australia seeking better economic conditions. But setting all that aside, the British had to do something with their criminals that they were sending to the United States, what was now the United States. And so that's when they started to push eastward, and they already knew Australia was there. So they established a colony, which you can see the yellow part there down by Sydney in the southeast of Australia, and Tasmania. So there they have it. They have some place to send their criminals, and while they're there, they have a base that can be used for further exploration as needed in other places. It made it a little bit easier. We're speaking now about the 1780s and the 1790s, so the color coding on this map is not as precise as it could be, but it gives you an idea of how this expansion was occurring. You can see that the British were already established in India, and that they pushed inland to the west into what is present-day Pakistan, what is the present-day Afghanistan. And you can also see that they were pushing to the east into Burma and down into peninsular Malaysia, where you see it says Straits settlements there. We'll get into that after a bit. And they also went further to the east. They established themselves in Hong Kong, as we will discuss in future talks as well, in 1842. But for now, we can focus on Southeast Asia. Let's go ahead and go to slide 16. Rubber was extremely important for trying to understand the imperial expansion that occurred in Southeast Asia during this time. Rubber can only be grown in a few places. It was being grown in Brazil, and there was this idea of a rubber boom that we'll get into in the next slide. But it was being grown in Brazil, and while it was being grown in Brazil, the vulcanizing process was discovered in 1844 by Charles Goodyear, the same name that is associated with the tires here in this country, Charles Goodyear, 1844. And as I've explained in this slide, natural rubber was kind of nice, but it was also not very good at low temperatures or high temperatures, but vulcanizing the rubber by adding sulfur and heating it, curing it, caused it to become much more durable, and there it could be used as gaskets and seals in the increasingly sophisticated machinery that came out of the Industrial Revolution. Now, this doesn't seem like much on the surface. However, if you are concerned with having a faster ship in your Navy, if you are concerned with better manufacturing of armaments, then having these sorts of things to use in the machinery so that they can replace the ineffective parts that had been used up until that time, it was a big deal. Rubber was also used in things like soles for shoes, and here we're talking about boots for soldiers so that they can keep going on the battlefield, this sort of thing. So this became an important element of the maintenance of national power. Going on to the next slide, which is just slide 17. I'm getting ahead of myself a little bit here. Once car tires came to be important in the early 20th century, then rubber became a really big deal because that was not only a big consumer good, a big military good, but it also became a big consumer good, and we're talking about huge amounts of money. So Brazil, the rubber plant was native to Brazil, and the Brazilians and the Portuguese controlled its production. That's no good if you're sitting in the Admiralty in London, thinking about how the Portuguese, even though they're allied with us, are controlling all this production. What you want is something a little bit different. So when this adventurer named Henry Wickham and his wife Violet came back from Brazil with 70,000, that's 7 followed by 4 zeros, 70,000 rubber seeds, and gave some of them to the gardens at Kew, which is now in metropolitan London. It was a big deal. I recommend going to Kew, by the way. If you ever visit London, get on the tube and go out to Kew. Make sure you allow about 6 hours for the whole thing. It's quite a place to visit, and it's a historical place as well. So experimentation began. It took decades to really get it going, and as the Industrial Revolution really picked up in the 1870s and 80s, then there was this rubber boom in Brazil. After 1912, the production of rubber was in full swing in places like Malaya, Indonesia, Cambodia, which was, of course, part of French Indochina, and the British established rubber production in the Congo as well. So if you're looking for a reason why colonial exploitation took place, I'm trying to describe it to you here. These things were what they were. The rubber boom petered out in Brazil around 1912 because of all this other rubber production that finally took hold. Of course, it takes time to plant entire rubber plantations and really get the production up to snuff. But in the 1880s and 1890s, this production was ramping up, and it was taking place. It's just that it wasn't enough to replace Brazil. So let's go on to slide 18 and talk about the other factors here. Tin was also a big deal for national power, because tin was used to can food, and what do you need if you have an army on the march or a navy on the seas? You need preserved food. And having tin in large amounts, therefore, became a strategic commodity just to keep the soldiers and sailors and marines fed. Tin was also used in the coatings that were necessary in food production machinery before the advent of stainless steel, which only came decades later. So tin was a big deal. Important to military, important to civilian population, to feeding the civilian population. As well, there were markets in each of these places for British manufactured goods, French manufactured goods. This is one of the big deals about imperialism that I think everybody knows about. And by taking hold of the Straits of Malacca that pass by Singapore, that lie between India and China, the British were able to secure a very important sea lane, and this meant that they were able to freely ship opium to China. We'll learn more about that in subsequent weeks. This was a big deal as well, something that enhanced British power. So, as these national security factors were trumping the previously important consumer trade that came out of Asia, that continued, but was no longer the most important thing, then both the British and the Dutch replaced the administrators from the private companies, that is the British East Asia Company and the VOC, the Dutch East Asia Company, East India Company rather, British East India and Dutch East India Companies, and replaced those people with colonial officials from the central government who, of course, were more reliable. Let's go on to slide 19 now and talk about the French and Indochina. So as rubber and tin became more urgent and important, there's also tin in Indochina besides rubber. The French decided that in this earlier stage, when they were competing strongly with the British, when they were basically still enemies, in the mid and late 1800s, the French decided they needed to be out there too. They needed to have their own source for these things, and they had the same advantages that all the other Europeans ended up having at the same period in China: superior weaponry, much better organization. They were able to exploit social divisions in Vietnam. As I mentioned before, there was a social divide between people who wanted to model Vietnam after China and those who did not. There was also a divide between North and South. It's very old. That's detailed in the chapter on Vietnam in the Owen readings that I highly recommend. Because this became quite important to modern history, as well as we will see in subsequent weeks. The French also exploited the Cambodian desire. They still had a kingdom there. They exploited the Cambodian desire to avoid subjugation by the Vietnamese and the Siamese, which had plagued them for many centuries and still plagues them today. Let's go on to slide 20. And talk about maritime Southeast Asia, which you see depicted here. Now, again, this is not the best map, but it's kind of an interesting one because it shows now Borneo, the gigantic island in the middle of maritime Southeast Asia, you can see was not ever really penetrated, even by Islam. Um, the penetration of first, well, animism was the native religion of this region of Melanesia, is what you can call this entire region. Um, Animism was gradually not replaced, but supplemented by Hinduism, as you can see. It's not really shown here, but Hinduism penetrated throughout the coastal areas, especially today. You can still see Hinduism in Bali, and evangelical Islam spread as is shown on this map. It followed the trade relations really. It came from trade relations through each religion came through trade relations, followed trade routes. And I think it's important to understand here that Indonesia remains a place, and we'll discuss this in more detail later. Indonesia remains a place where the mysterious, the unseen, remains a very important part of the consciousness of ordinary people. The same is true in Thailand. In modern-day Thailand, people change their names if they think it's going to bring them better luck, and this is not connected with Buddhism. It's older than that. Going on to slide 21. So the Dutch were already down there. They had displaced the Portuguese in some places and had begun intense trading relations. And as I mentioned in the first week, the British did not want the French in the early 19th and mid 19th century to outflank them and start taking over parts of maritime Southeast Asia, parts of present-day Indonesia. They were happier having the Dutch there because the Dutch, of course, were a weaker power. They did not want their enemies, their rivals, the French, in Indonesia. So that was one of the reasons that an agreement was reached that the Dutch would, if they didn't want the British to mess with them, they would fully colonize all of present-day Indonesia. So at this time, the Yogyakarta Sultanate was the strongest in the archipelago, but as you can see on this map, this is just the central area of Java, the main island that was talked about in the Stratfor video for this week. You can see that Yogyakarta was not very big. Yogyakarta was completely Islamic, and Islam was the strongest religious influence in the region. And because of this, Islam became the preferred religion of resistance to the Dutch, and today it remains the preferred religion of resistance to the West. There was a series of wars that are explained in the reading, but not in too much detail, because in this course we can't really afford to dive that deep. But the bottom line was that the Dutch pursued warfare when they had to. They tried to make gains through negotiation whenever possible, and they gradually hemmed in the sultanates so that they controlled less and less area, and the Dutch controlled more. The Dutch would bring in people from other parts of present-day Indonesia, such as Ambon, to police areas that were foreign to them. But they were local troops, and they didn't have to be Dutch troops, and this made it all a little bit easier. So go on to slide 22. The end result was what you see here. I've tried to blow this up as big as I could. The Java War of 1825 to 30 was won in the way that I just described, and which is very well described in our readings. and the Anglo-Dutch treaties of 1824 and 1871 created the conditions under which the Dutch were able to consolidate their position throughout the Indonesian archipelago without any outside interference, and with actually a guarantee that the British would keep other powers out. It's interesting to note, by the way, that from Aceh in the far west there, in the far left-hand portion of the map, down to Timor-Leste, the East Timor in the bottom right, this is as far a distance as lies between Honolulu and Tokyo. It's an enormous distance. It was quite an achievement in the context of colonial exploitation for the Dutch to have been able to do what they did, but it created the seeds for the eventual loss of these areas by the Dutch after World War II, and certainly it meant that even though the Japanese were able to conquer the area, most of it during the war, they were far overstretched, and having to police this large area as well as others, especially mainland China, was one of the roots of the defeat of Japan in World War II, but we'll get to that. Moving on to slide 23, this is our last one. So this was the result throughout Asia that we've been talking about. You have an independent Siam in the middle between the French and the British, but by the time we get to this point, the late 19th century into the early 20th century, a shift in the dynamic has occurred. The French and the British are no longer enemies. They are allies. They are allied against the Germans in World War I. They continue to be allies. They cooperate with each other. They do not. There's no longer any prospect really of war between the French and the British. The Japanese joined the Allies, at least on paper, in World War I. The Americans were with the Allies in World War I. They are holding the Philippines, as you can see. Even Portugal, which was neutral in World War II, was on the Allied side in the First World War. And so it's all one big happy family for the colonial powers. I'm being a little bit facetious, but there's some truth to this. And the independent nations are hard-pressed. The Japanese have taken over Korea. By this point, this is something we'll get into later as we talk about, that's next week, as we talk about how Japan managed to get a jump out of the starting gate and become an imperialist themselves. But you can see that China is, you can't see how China is thoroughly colonized by this point on this map, but we will get into that as well. You can see that Tibet is an independent entity at this point, and that the peoples of Southeast Asia, I would not hesitate to call them the victim peoples of Southeast Asia, are without any recourse at this point. However, the way they are treated by their colonial masters and the conditions under which they labor are the root of nationalism that begins to take hold as time goes on, and especially after the Bolshevik Revolution. We will get into that in subsequent weeks, but next week we will talk about the rise of Japan. Take care of yourselves, get enough sleep, and all that stuff. See you around.